The courthouse steps were wet, and Tess Calloway sat down on the third one from the bottom even though it was wet, because her legs had stopped agreeing to hold her up somewhere around the words judgment for the plaintiff. She had a folder in her lap. The folder held everything: the lease, the photographs, the inspection reports, 11 months of correspondence she'd printed at the library because she didn't have a printer, all of it organized with colored tabs because she'd believed, right up until 40 minutes ago, that being organized would matter, that the truth, laid out neatly with colored tabs, would be enough. She'd believed it the way you believe a thing you have no choice but to believe, because the alternative was lying awake, and she'd done enough of the lying awake. It hadn't been enough. The man across the aisle had a lawyer in a suit that cost more than Tess made in a month, and the lawyer had said words that turned the truth sideways until it didn't look like the truth anymore. And the judge, tired, overbooked, 40 cases behind, had signed the thing without ever quite looking at Tess's colored tabs. And now Tess owed money she didn't have to a man who'd wronged her, and the bakery was gone. Not gone yet, but gone. She understood the difference, and she understood it would stop mattering soon. A pigeon investigated the step below her. The rain had thinned to a mist that wasn't quite falling, just hanging in the air the way bad news hangs in a room after it's been said. Tess opened the folder, looked at the top page, the lease, her own signature at the bottom, 18 months younger and so much more hopeful, and closed it again, because looking at it was like looking at a photograph of someone who died. Her phone buzzed. The school. She let it go to voicemail and then immediately felt the specific guilt of a mother who'd let the school go to voicemail and listened. Nothing wrong, just a reminder that Mr. Okonkwo wanted to talk about Daniel's exceptional aptitude, and could she please call back to schedule. Exceptional aptitude. Her 9-year-old, who took apart the toaster and put it back together better, who'd fixed the bakery's ancient mixer twice when the repair quote would have closed her 2 months early, who had exceptional aptitude, and a mother sitting on a wet courthouse step with a folder full of useless colored tabs. "Okay," Tess said to no one, to the pigeon. "Okay, think." But there wasn't anything to think. That was the trouble. She'd been thinking for 11 months, and the thinking had led here, to the steps, to the judgment, to the slow math of how many weeks the bakery had left now that she owed Bram Holly's $4,000 she didn't have on top of the rent she could barely make. Bram Holly's. She let herself hate him for a minute, sitting there, because hating him was warmer than being afraid. Bram Holly's owned the building. He'd owned it when Tess signed the lease, all handshakes and warmth, a developer with a folksy way of talking who told her he loved seeing young entrepreneurs take a chance on the neighborhood. And then the neighborhood had started to turn, a coffee chain 2 blocks down, a condo conversion across the street, and Bram Holly's had stopped loving young entrepreneurs and started loving the higher rent he could get if Tess's little bakery weren't in the way of whatever he wanted to build. So the heat had failed in January and he hadn't fixed it. The water had come through the ceiling in March and he hadn't fixed that either. And when Tess had withheld 1 month's rent, after documenting everything, after the city inspector agreed the place wasn't being maintained, Bram Holly's had taken her to court, and his expensive lawyer had made the 1 withheld month into a story about an unreliable tenant, and the tired judge had signed the paper. She knew how it went from here. She'd watched it happen to the laundromat, to the shoe repair. The judgment was just the crowbar, the eviction was the door coming off. 6 weeks, maybe 8. Then a chain-link fence and a banner that said coming soon and a number to call for leasing inquiries. The Rolling Pin, that was the bakery's name. Daniel had named it when he was 7, thought it was the funniest thing in the world, and Tess had let him because his laugh that day had been the first real one since his father left, and you don't say no to a laugh like that. She'd had a sign made. A real sign, hand-painted, more than she could afford, because some things you spend the money on even when you can't, because they're not really about money. She was going to have to take the sign down. That was the thought that finally did it, sitting on the wet step, not the judgment, not the $4,000, not even the slow math. The sign, taking down the sign Daniel named. That was the thought that broke something loose, and Tess Calloway put her face in her hands, on the third step from the bottom of the courthouse, with her folder of colored tabs, and cried the way you cry when you've been holding it for 11 months, and the holding is finally over because there's nothing left to hold it for. She let herself go back over it, the way you press a bruise, how she'd gotten here, how a person ended up on a courthouse step at 34 with a folder and a dead dream. The bakery had been the thing that saved her after Wade left. That was the part the judgment couldn't see, the part that didn't fit in the lawyer's story about an unreliable tenant. Wade, Daniel's father, had left when Daniel was 6, and he hadn't left the dramatic way, the way that at least gives you a villain to organize around. He'd left the slow way, the way a tide goes out, present and then less present and then mostly absent, and then one day just a name on a birthday card that came late or not at all. He'd had a restlessness in him that Tess had mistaken, at 23, for ambition, and it had taken her years to learn the difference, which was that ambition builds something and restlessness only ever leaves. Wade left to chase a series of things that were always just about to work out in other cities, and the money he'd promised to send came twice and then never. And Tess had found herself 28 years old with a 6-year-old and a part-time job at someone else's bakery, and a decision to make about what kind of life she was going to build out of the wreckage. She'd chosen the bakery. It was insane. Everyone told her it was insane, her sister loudest of all, to take the small inheritance from her grandmother, the only money she'd ever have, and sink it into a lease on a failing storefront in a neighborhood that hadn't turned yet. But Tess had worked in bakeries since she was 16, knew bread the way some people know music, in the hands below language, and she'd understood something her sister hadn't, which was that a person who's been left needs to build a thing of their own more than they need to be safe. The bakery wasn't a business decision. It was a refusal. It was Tess Calloway standing in the wreckage Wade left, and deciding she was going to make something that rose on purpose every morning with her own hands, whether or not anyone ever came back. And it had worked. Not richly, never richly, it was always thin, always one bad month from trouble, but it had worked in the way that mattered, which was that it had become a home. Daniel had grown up in it, on a stool behind the counter, doing homework on flour-dusted paper, taking apart the equipment in the back while his mother worked the front. The regulars knew him. The regulars knew him, watched him grow, brought him broken radios and toasters because word had gotten around that the Calloway boy could fix anything, and Daniel had a little workbench in the back corner that Tess had built him out of an old door, and the bakery wasn't just where Tess made her living. It was the entire world she'd constructed to raise her son in after his father proved the first world unreliable. It was the proof that you could be left and still build. It was everything. That was what Bram Hollies had taken, with his unfixed heat and his expensive lawyer and his story about an unreliable tenant, not a storefront. The world Tess had built to replace the one Wade broke. And the worst part, the part that had her crying on the step, was that she'd done everything right. She documented every failure, photographed every leak, called the city, kept the records, organized the truth with colored tabs, and right hadn't been enough. Because right is never enough against a man who can afford to make right look wrong. And Tess had learned that lesson at 34 on a wet courthouse step, far too late to do anything with it. The rolling pin. Daniel had named it at 7, thought it was the funniest thing in the world. She was going to have to take down the sign. She didn't hear the helicopter at first. The crying was too loud inside her head. By the time she noticed it, it was close. That heavy chopping pressure in the air that you feel in your chest before your ears catch up. And she looked up, wet-faced, annoyed at it the way you're annoyed at anything that interrupts a good cry, and watched it come down toward the small park across the street from the courthouse, the one with the dead fountain, descending out of the gray like something that didn't belong in this part of the city at all. Helicopters didn't land here. This wasn't the part of the city where helicopters landed. This was the part of the city where people took 2 buses to a courthouse to lose to men in expensive suits. Tess wiped her face with the back of her hand and watched, because there was nothing else to do, and because watching a helicopter was better than thinking about the sign. It set down in the park with a roar that scattered the pigeons and flattened the dead grass, and the rotors slowed, and a door opened, and a person got out, a woman, older, in a long coat, who ducked under the blades the practiced way of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, and who straightened up, and who looked across the street directly at the courthouse steps. Directly, it seemed, at Tess. Which was impossible. The woman didn't know her. Tess was a stranger crying on a step. But the woman stood there in the flattened grass with her coat moving in the rotor wash and looked across the street. And then she started walking, and she was walking toward the courthouse, toward the steps, toward Tess, and Tess had the disorienting sensation of being approached on purpose by a person who'd arrived by helicopter, which did not happen, which was not a thing that happened to women like her on days like this. She wiped her face again, uselessly, and sat up a little straighter, the old reflex of a woman who'd learned not to let anyone see exactly how hard she'd been hit. The woman reached the bottom of the steps. Up close she was maybe 70, silver-haired, with a face that had been weathered by something more interesting than age, and sharp pale eyes that took in Tess, the wet step, the folder, the cried-out face, in a single sweep that missed nothing. "Tess Calloway," the woman said. And Tess, who had not told this stranger her name, who had no idea in the world how this stranger knew it, said the only thing her stunned and grieving brain could produce. "Did I do something else wrong?" The woman's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "No, you did everything right, that's rather the point." She glanced up at the courthouse, at its gray columns with an expression of frank dislike. "You did everything right and you lost anyway because the man you were up against could afford to make right look wrong and the system was too tired to tell the difference. I watched the whole thing." She nodded at a spot, vaguely, the back of the courtroom. "I've been watching for a while, actually. May I sit?" Tess moved her folder. The woman sat down on the wet step beside her without any apparent concern for the long coat, which Tess suspected cost a great deal, and for a moment the two of them just sat there, the strange old woman and the cried-out single mother, watching the mist not quite fall. "My name is Adelaide Frost," the woman said. "It won't mean anything to you, which is fine, it's not supposed to. I spent a long time making sure my name didn't mean anything to most people. Privacy's the only luxury that actually stays a luxury. Everything else gets cheap eventually." She had an odd way of talking, dry and precise, like every sentence had been considered and found acceptable before release. "I'm going to tell you some things, and they're going to sound implausible, and I'd ask you to hear all of them before you decide I'm a lunatic, because you've had a hard day and I don't want to add accosted by a madwoman to it." "You came in a helicopter," Tess said. It was all she could manage. "I did. It's vulgar, I know. I don't usually. But I was 300 miles away when I heard how this was going, and I wanted to reach you before you left these steps, before you went home and started doing the math and talked yourself into despair, because despair is a decision and I've found it's much harder to undo than to prevent." Adelaide Frost folded her hands. "So, the implausible things. Are you ready?" Tess wasn't ready for anything, but she nodded because the alternative was going home to the math. "I own a company," Adelaide said. "Several, but one that matters here. We make commercial kitchen equipment, ovens, mixers, proofing systems, the unglamorous machines that every bakery and restaurant in the country runs on and nobody thinks about until they break. I built it from a single welding shop 60 years ago, when a woman building anything was considered a kind of joke, and I am now, I'm told, quite wealthy, though the money stopped being real to me sometime around my 4th decade, and now it's just a number that other people get excited about. She looked at Tess. I'm telling you this so you understand the next part isn't charity, because I can see in your face that you're a woman who'd rather drown than take charity, and I respect that. I'm the same, so I want to be clear. What I'm about to offer you isn't a gift. It's the best business decision I'll make this year, and you're going to earn every cent of it. And the only reason I came in a helicopter is that I'm 73, and I've learned that when you find the right person you move fast. Because the right person is the rarest thing there is, and the world is full of people who'll talk them out of themselves by morning. The right person for what? Tess's voice came out smaller than she wanted. Adelaide Frost reached into her coat and took out a phone, an ordinary phone, scratched, older than Tess's, and turned the screen toward her. On it was a photograph, a close-up of a machine. An old commercial mixer, its housing open, its guts exposed. And someone had done something to those guts, rerouted, rebuilt, improvised a repair out of mismatched parts that should not have worked and somehow, visibly, did. Do you recognize this? Adelaide asked. Tess stared at the photo. That's my mixer, the Hartwell. How do you have a picture of my? Because the repair tech your landlord sent, months ago, the one who came once and quoted you $4,000 to replace it, took this picture. He took it because he'd never seen anything like it. He sent it to his supervisor as a kind of joke. Look what this lady did to keep her mixer running. And his supervisor sent it to the regional rep, and the regional rep, who happens to work for me, sent it up the chain with a note, because part of my company's culture, the part I'm proudest of, is that when someone sees genius in the wild, they flag it. They send it up, because genius in the wild is the only thing I've ever found worth chasing. Adelaide turned the phone back to look at the photo herself, with something like affection. Whoever rebuilt this mixer understood the machine better than the engineers who designed it. That's not an exaggeration. I had my actual engineers look at it. They argued for an hour about whether the repair was even possible and then admitted, grudgingly, that not only was it possible, it was better than the original, that the person who did this had solved, with junk parts and instinct, a flaw in our own design that we've been ignoring for 15 years. She looked up. I came 300 miles by helicopter to find the person who did that. I assumed it was you. The bakery's in your name. And Tess Calloway, on the wet courthouse step, with the worst day of her recent life not yet over, felt the strangest laugh rise up through the tears, because the truth was so absurd and so perfect that there was nothing to do but tell it. It wasn't me, she said. I can barely change a light bulb. She wiped her face one more time. It was my son. It was Daniel, he's 9. For the first time since she'd gotten out of the helicopter, Adelaide Frost looked surprised. It was a small thing, a stillness, a recalibration behind the sharp pale eyes, but Tess caught it, because she'd spent the morning watching a lawyer recalibrate the truth, and she'd gotten sensitive to the look. 9, Adelaide repeated. 9, he named the bakery too, the rolling pin. He thought it was hilarious. Tess almost smiled, and then the almost smile collapsed because the bakery was gone and so was the sign Daniel named. He's always been like that, with machines, since he was tiny. His father, she stopped, picked her way around it. His father wasn't around much, and Daniel kind of raised himself on the inside of things. Took apart everything we owned. The toaster, the radio, the vacuum, put them back better. The mixer broke twice and the repair quote was $4,000, which I didn't have, which is actually the same $4,000 I now owe the man who, she gestured at the courthouse, couldn't finish, started again. Daniel watched the repair guy say it couldn't be fixed for less than $4,000, and then after the guy left, Daniel just fixed it over a weekend. With parts from the hardware store and some stuff out of an old fan. I didn't even really watch him do it. I was working the counter. He just came and told me it was done, and it was, and it's run perfect ever since. She looked at Adelaide. He's 9. He doesn't know he did anything special. He thinks everybody can do it. He gets frustrated at school because they're still doing times tables, and he wants to know how the heating system works." Adelaide Frost was quiet for a long moment, looking at the photograph on her scratched old phone, and when she spoke her voice had changed. Some of the dryness gone out of it, replaced by something Tess couldn't name yet. "His teacher wants to talk to you about his exceptional aptitude," Adelaide said. "It wasn't a question." Tess stared. "How could you possibly?" "I couldn't, I guessed. It's what they always say, the teachers, when they've got a child like this and no idea what to do with him. Exceptional aptitude, as if it's a problem to be managed." Adelaide put the phone away. "I was a child like this, Tess, a long time ago. Before they had the words for it, before there were programs, before anyone thought a girl who'd rather rebuild an engine than play with dolls was anything but broken. My own mother apologized for me. To guests, 'You'll have to excuse Adelaide, she's not quite right.' And I spent the first 30 years of my life believing her, believing I was not quite right, until I built one machine that worked better than the machine the men had built, and then another, and slowly, much too slowly, understood that I wasn't broken, I was simply early, and that the world has no idea what to do with people who arrive early except to apologize for them." She looked at Tess with the pale eyes. "I don't want your son apologized for. I've spent the last 20 years of my life, and a great deal of my money making sure children like the child I was don't have to wait 30 years to find out they're not broken." And then a photograph of a rebuilt mixer crossed my desk, and I got in a helicopter, because the world is full of Daniels and almost all of them get ground down before anyone sees them. And every so often, if I move fast enough, I get to see one before the grinding. That's the whole of it. That's why I'm here." The mist had stopped. The pigeons had come back. Somewhere behind them in the courthouse, Tess's loss was being filed and stamped and made permanent. And out here on the steps, a woman who'd come by helicopter was telling her that the strange, beautiful inside-out way her son saw the world was not a problem to be managed, but the rarest thing there was. "I don't understand what you're offering," Tess said carefully, because she'd been handed false hope before by Bram Hollies with his folksy warmth, and she'd learned to ask the hard question before she let herself feel anything. "You said it's not charity, so what is it?" "You can't, he's 9. You can't hire a 9-year-old, what's the—" "No, I can't hire a 9-year-old, that would be both illegal and idiotic, and Daniel needs to be a child first and a genius second, which is a thing nobody ever let me be and which I intend for him." Adelaide stood and offered Tess her hand, and her grip when Tess took it was startlingly strong, a welder's grip, 60 years of it. "What I'm offering is more complicated than a job and more interesting than charity, and it involves you as much as it involves him, because I didn't come here to scoop up a gifted child and leave his mother on a courthouse step. That's not how I work. Children come attached to the people who kept them alive, and I've learned to value those people highly." She pulled Tess up. "But I'm not going to explain it on a wet step outside a building that just robbed you. Come have lunch. Not in the helicopter, I can see that's a bridge too far for one day, and frankly the helicopter was a mistake. It makes everything feel like a hostage situation. There's a diner 4 blocks from here. I checked. It has pie." Her mouth did the not quite smile again. "I've found that almost everything important in my life got decided over pie in a diner, and almost nothing important ever got decided in a boardroom, and at 73 I've stopped fighting the pattern. Walk with me. Bring your folder. You're going to want the folder for what I'm about to tell you, though not for the reason you organized it." The diner was called Sal's, and it had pie, exactly as advertised, and Adelaide Frost ordered a slice of each kind they had, all 4, and pushed them to the middle of the table like a dare. And Tess understood that this was a woman who'd learned to make people comfortable by being slightly ridiculous on purpose, the way some powerful people do once they've stopped needing to perform their power. "Here's the thing I do," Adelaide said, once the coffee was poured and the pies were arrayed. "The foundation. It's the only part of my life I still care about, the rest runs itself. We find children, the early ones, the ones the world's about to apologize for, and we don't pluck them out of their lives. That's the mistake everyone makes. The well-meaning people who discover a gifted kid and put him in some hothouse program 3 states away and break him on the rocks of being special and alone. We did that for years before I understood it was cruelty wearing kindness's coat. Now we do something better. We build the world around the child instead of pulling the child out of the world. She took a bite of pie, considered it, nodded as if it had passed an audition. Which means Daniel stays where he is. Same neighborhood, same friends, same you, but we change what's available to him. A mentor, a real engineer, someone who will take his questions seriously and never once say, "You'll understand when you're older." Tools, a workshop, access to the kind of problems his brain is starving for, and a school that won't bore him into hating learning, which is the great danger with these kids. That's how you lose them, not by pushing too hard, but by boring them until the gift feels like a burden and they bury it just to fit in. She set down her fork. We've done it 40 times now. I can show you the children. Some of them are adults now, doing things that matter. The point isn't to manufacture prodigies. The point is to make sure the prodigy that already exists doesn't get ground into paste by a world built for the average. Average is fine. Average runs the world, and I've nothing against it. But a Daniel in an average machine is a tragedy, and I've buried enough of those tragedies to have made stopping them my entire reason for still being upright. Tess held her coffee with both hands. And what's the catch? Smart, there's always a catch, isn't there? You've learned that. Adelaide nodded approvingly. The catch is 2 things. First, it's real, which means it's work, which means Daniel will be challenged in ways that are sometimes hard, and there'll be days he's frustrated and days you wonder if it's worth it. And it's not a fairy tale where the gifted child sails happily into a bright future. It's a child with an unusual mind getting the support that mind needs, with all the ordinary difficulty of raising any child layered on top. I won't pretend otherwise. The second catch is the one I think you'll like better. She leaned forward. The catch is you. Because here's what I learned looking at that mixer, and then looking into who you were while I flew here. Daniel didn't rebuild that machine in a vacuum. 9-year-olds don't raise themselves, no matter what you said on the steps. Somebody made a home stable enough that a child felt safe enough to take apart the toaster instead of worrying about whether there'd be dinner. Somebody worked the counter and ran the books and fought the landlord and kept a small business alive for years against odds that would have flattened most people, all so that her son could have the kind of childhood where his brain was free to play. You think you can barely change a light bulb, but you built the conditions that built him. That's not nothing, Tess. That's the rarest engineering there is, and almost no one ever gets credit for it because it doesn't photograph well. Adelaide's pale eyes were steady. So here's the catch. I don't want to support Daniel and leave you on the courthouse step. I want to fix the step. I want you stable, secure, not lying awake doing math. Because a Daniel with a mother lying awake doing math is a Daniel who'll feel it, who'll start worrying instead of playing, who'll bury the gift to take care of you, which is exactly what these kids do. They're more perceptive than anyone and they carry what they shouldn't have to. So part of what I'm offering, and it's the part that's a business decision, not charity, and I'll explain why, is a job. For you. A real one. At my company. Running something I actually need run. Tess set down her coffee. I make bread. I don't know anything about commercial kitchen equipment. You know more than anyone I employ. Adelaide said it flatly, a fact. Everyone at my company knows how the machines work. Nobody, not one person I've checked, knows what it's actually like to run a small bakery on a thin margin in a hard neighborhood with one of our machines as the difference between making rent and closing. You do. You've lived inside the problem my entire company exists to solve, from the side we never see. We design ovens in a laboratory for a customer we've never met. You're the customer. You're every customer. And I have spent years trying to get my engineers to understand the small operator, the woman who can't afford the $4,000 repair, who needs the machine that lasts 20 years instead of the one that's cheaper today, who doesn't have an IT department or a maintenance contract. And I've failed because you can't explain a life to someone who hasn't lived it. She tapped the table. I want you to be the voice of that customer inside my company. Product development. Real title, real salary, real authority. You'd go into the design meetings and tell 40 engineers why the thing they're so proud of would have bankrupted you in the field. You'd be impossible and necessary, and they'd hate you for about 6 months, and then they'd build better machines than they've ever built, because for the first time they'd be building for a real person instead of a spreadsheet. The not quite smile again. That's the job. It's not charity. It's the thing my company has been missing for 60 years, and I only realized it was missing when I saw what your son did to that mixer, and understood the whole family had been trying to tell us something we were too proud to hear. Tess sat in the diner booth with 4 kinds of pie going cold between them and the folder of colored tabs beside her, the folder that had been useless in court an hour ago, and she felt something she had not let herself feel in 11 months, something so unfamiliar that she almost didn't recognize it, and that she distrusted on sight the way you distrust a sound in an empty house. Hope, the actual thing, not the false folksy kind Bram Hollies had sold her, the real, terrifying kind that costs you something to feel because it can be taken away. "Why me?" she said, and her voice cracked on it, and she hated that it cracked. "You could find 100 people who have run small bakeries. Why fly 300 miles for me and my kid today on the worst day, when I've got nothing, when I just lost, when I'm exactly the worst bet you could?" "Because," Adelaide Frost said, and now the dryness was entirely gone, and what was left was something old and certain and kind. "The worst day is exactly when you find out what someone's made of. I didn't want to meet you on a good day, Tess. Anyone's impressive on a good day. I wanted to see what you did on the worst one, whether you'd organized your folder with colored tabs even knowing the system might not look, whether you'd sit on a wet step and break, and then sit up straight when a stranger approached, whether you'd tell me the truth about the mixer when a lie would have served you better. You passed every one of those without knowing you were being watched. That's the only kind of test worth running, and you passed it on the day you had every reason to fail it." She finally pushed a plate of pie directly in front of Tess, the gesture of a grandmother and a CEO at once. "Now eat something. You've been running on adrenaline and grief since this morning, and you're about to have a great deal to think about, and nobody's ever made a good decision hungry. Eat the pie. The cherry's the best, I've decided. And then let's talk about your son and his bakery and the sign he named, because I heard you say it on the steps. I'm going to have to take down the sign, and I want to tell you something about that sign that I think is going to change how the rest of this day goes." "The sign," Tess said. "What about the sign?" "You don't have to take it down." Adelaide said it simply and let it sit and watched Tess not understand. "I bought the building." The diner went on around them, the fry cook calling an order, a trucker laughing at the counter, a baby fussing 2 booths down, and Tess sat very still in the middle of it. "You what?" "This morning, while you were in court losing to him. I bought the building from Bram Hollies." Adelaide refilled her own coffee from the carafe the waitress had left, unhurried, like she was describing the weather. "It wasn't hard. Men like Hollies are always selling. That's the whole engine of them. They buy a thing to flip it. They've no attachment to anything. The building was already quietly on the market because he'd gotten what he needed out of evicting you, a clean lease line for the condo developer he was courting. I simply offered him more than the developer, through a holding company so my name didn't spook the price, and he took it before lunch, delighted, never knowing or caring who I was. He thinks he won today. He'll go home and tell someone he won twice, beat the tenant in court, and sold the building same morning." Her pale eyes glinted. "He doesn't know that the woman he beat in court is going to be his building's most valued employee by Friday, and that the building he sold is going to keep her son's bakery open with the sign the boy named still hanging over the door. He'll never know. That's the part I enjoy. I'll admit it. I'm not a saint. He'll never know he lost. He'll go to his grave thinking this was the day he won. There's a justice in invisible justice that the loud kind never has." Tess's hands had started to shake. She put them flat on the table to stop them. I can't, Adelaide. I can't pay the rent on that building. That was the hole, that's why I'm losing it. I can't make the rent, and now I owe him $4,000 on top. The judgment, I can't. The judgment's being vacated. My lawyer's filing this afternoon. Turns out when the actual building owner submits the maintenance records that your landlord conveniently lost, the records that prove the heat and the water were never fixed, the case looks rather different, and a judgment obtained by hiding evidence is a judgment that doesn't survive review. You won't owe him anything. He'll likely owe you for the months you operated in a building he let rot, but we can discuss whether you want to pursue that or simply let it go and never think about Bram Hollies again, which is what I'd recommend, because the best revenge on a small man is a large life he's not in. Adelaide set down her coffee. As for the rent, you won't pay what you were paying. You'll pay what's fair, which is less, because I'm not in the business of squeezing bakeries. I'm in the business of building machines that bakeries can afford to run, and a thriving small operator in my own building is worth more to me as a living laboratory than the few $100s a month I'd gouge out of you. The rolling pin stays open. Daniel keeps his bakery. The sign stays up. And you, she tapped the folder of colored tabs, you keep that not because you'll ever need it again, but because someday Daniel's going to be old enough to understand what his mother did, sitting in a courtroom with no lawyer and no money, organizing the truth with colored tabs against a man who could afford to bury it, and I want him to see the folder and understand that he didn't get his stubbornness from nowhere. You think the gift came from him. The gift came through him. It started with you on the worst days refusing to lie down. The colored tabs are the same thing as the rebuilt mixer. They're both somebody refusing to accept that the broken thing has to stay broken. That's the family trait. That's what I flew 300 miles for, not a clever boy. A clever boy is common enough. A clever boy with a mother who organizes the truth with colored tabs on the day she loses everything. That's the thing I've spent my life learning to recognize, because that's the thing that actually changes the world, and it almost never gets seen. Tess Calloway put her face in her hands for the second time that day, in the booth at Sal's, with 4 kinds of pie and a stranger who'd come by helicopter, and cried again. But it was a different crying. She'd noticed later, telling Daniel, telling her sister, telling the story for years. The crying on the steps had been the end of something. This crying was the beginning, and the body knows the difference even when the eyes look the same. And Adelaide Frost sat across from her, and didn't reach over and didn't say they're there, and didn't perform comfort. Just let her cry it out the way you let weather pass. Because Adelaide Frost had learned in 73 years that the kindest thing you can do for a proud person who's crying with relief is to let them, and to push the cherry pie a little closer for when they're done. You said you watched the whole thing, Tess said when she'd surfaced, when the crying had run its course and she'd eaten enough cherry pie to function. In the courtroom, how much did you see? All of it. I came in just as it started, sat in the back. Adelaide's face did something complicated. I'd flown in meaning to find you after at the bakery, the gentle way, with a coffee and a conversation. And then I got to the courthouse and learned the hearing was that morning, and I thought, I'll watch first. I'll see how she handles herself when she doesn't know anyone's looking. And what I watched, she paused. Tell me what you remember. I want to hear it from inside it. I only saw the outside. And Tess, because the day had broken something open in her that made the truth come easy, told her. She remembered the lawyer first. Bram Hollies' lawyer, a smooth man named Pelham who'd never once raised his voice, which was the frightening part. Tess had braced for aggression and gotten something worse, a calm professional certainty that made her documented truth sound like the confused complaints of an emotional woman. She remembered standing up to represent herself, because she couldn't afford a lawyer, because the legal aid office had a 3-month waiting list and her hearing was in 3 weeks. She remembered laying out her folder, her colored tabs, the photographs of the water coming through the ceiling, the inspector's report, the dates, January no heat, March the leak, 11 months of emails to a landlord who didn't answer. She remembered how solid it had felt in her hands, the truth, organized, undeniable. And she remembered how Pelham had taken it apart, not by disputing any of it. He never disputed a single fact, that was the horror, but by reframing all of it. The withheld rent became the story. Not the 11 months of unaddressed failures, the 1 month Tess hadn't paid. Ms. Calloway admits she withheld rent. Ms. Calloway took it upon herself to decide she didn't have to pay. Whatever her grievances, and landlords and tenants always have grievances, the law has a process, and Ms. Calloway chose to bypass that process and simply not pay. And a tenant who decides for herself which rent to pay is a tenant no property owner can rely on. It was so clean. It made Tess, who'd done everything by the book except the one desperate month, sound like a person who didn't follow rules, and the judge, overbooked, 40 cases behind, tired in the specific way of people who have watched the system grind too long to believe any single case is different. The judge had nodded along, because Pelham's version required no thought and Tess's version required reading 60 pages of colored tabs, and tired people choose the version that requires no thought. He didn't read the tabs, Tess said. The judge, I watched him not read them. I'd organized 11 months of proof and he flipped past it to get to the part where I withheld the rent, because that was the only part that mattered to the story Pelham told, and the story was easier than the truth, and the judge was tired, and tired beats true. That's what I learned today. I always thought if you were right and you could prove it, that was enough. It's not. Right plus tired judge plus expensive lawyer equals wrong. I did the math wrong my whole life. I thought truth was the variable that mattered. It's not even in the equation. Adelaide Frost listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Tess finished, the old woman was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something Tess would carry for the rest of her life. You're right about the courtroom, Adelaide said, and you're wrong about the lesson. The lesson isn't that truth doesn't matter. The lesson is that truth doesn't defend itself. It needs someone to see it, and the system is built to be too tired to see it on purpose, because a system that saw the truth every time would have to be fair, and fair is expensive, and the people who built the system would rather it be cheap. She leaned forward. But here's the part you couldn't see from inside it, the part I saw from the back row. While the judge wasn't reading your tabs, I was. I read every one. And I want you to understand what I saw, because it's the most important thing I'll say to you today. I saw a woman with no lawyer and no money, 3 weeks to prepare, a child at home, a business dying, and instead of falling apart, instead of showing up with a shoebox of crumpled papers like 90% of the people who represent themselves, you'd built a case so clear that a stranger in the back row understood the entire injustice in 4 minutes. You lost, but you didn't lose because your case was weak. You lost because the room was rigged and tired. And the difference between those two things is everything, Tess, because a person who loses with a weak case should quit, and a person who loses with a perfect case in a rigged room should be handed a bigger room. That's what the helicopter was. I came to hand you a bigger room. One where the truth you organize so beautifully actually gets seen, because I'll be the one looking, and I am never too tired to read the tabs. She sat back and pushed the cherry pie an inch closer, one more time. You did everything right, Adelaide said again, the words she'd opened with on the steps, landing differently now, fuller. I needed you to hear it from someone who actually read the tabs. You did everything right. The room was wrong. We're going to find you a better room. She told Daniel that night, and it did not go the way she expected, because nothing with Daniel ever went the way she expected. She'd rehearsed it on the bus home, how to explain a helicopter and a courthouse, and a woman named Adelaide Frost and a job and a saved bakery to a 9-year-old, how to make it land as the miracle it was. She'd built up to it over dinner, the way you build up to big news with a kid, and she'd finally said, Daniel, something happened today. Something really big and really good. And she'd told him, the whole thing, The mixer photograph and the engineers who'd argued for an hour and the foundation and the mentor and the workshop and the bakery staying open. And Daniel had listened, fork halfway to his mouth, and when she finished he was quiet for a second, processing it the way he processed everything from the inside out, and then he said, "They argued for an hour about the mixer." Of everything she'd told him, the helicopter, the saved bakery, the entire trajectory of both their lives bending upward in a single afternoon, that was the part that got him. The engineers arguing. "For an hour," she said, "about whether your repair was even possible." "It's obviously possible." Daniel looked genuinely confused. "I did it. How can grown-up engineers argue about whether a thing is possible when the thing is just sitting there working? You can go look at it. It's in the bakery. It's been working for 8 months. He put his fork down, and the confusion on his face was so pure, so untouched by any sense that he'd done something remarkable, that Tess understood for the first time fully what Adelaide had meant about the grinding. That Daniel didn't think he was special. He thought everyone was failing to see something obvious, and that the distance between those two things was exactly where a kid like him got lost. Are they not very good, the engineers? Is that why the mixer was designed wrong in the first place? They're very good, Bug. That's what makes it amazing that you saw something they didn't. But I didn't see something they didn't. I just looked at it. Daniel picked his fork back up, the matter apparently settled in his mind, the miracle of the day reduced to a minor puzzle about adult competence. When can I meet the mentor? Does the mentor know how the proofing systems work? Because I have questions about humidity control that nobody at school can answer, and Mr. Okonkwo just tells me it's not on the test. And Tess Calloway laughed, really laughed. The first real one in 11 months. The kind Daniel used to surprise out of her before the hard years. Because her son had just received the news that his entire life was about to change, and his only follow-up question was about humidity control. And that, right there, was the whole reason a woman had gotten into a helicopter. And Tess hadn't fully believed it until this exact moment. Watching her 9-year-old be completely unimpressed by a miracle, because he was too busy being curious about the next problem. "Yeah, Bug," she said. "The mentor knows about proofing systems. I'll make sure of it. You can ask all your questions. Nobody's going to tell you it's not on the test ever again." Daniel nodded, satisfied, and went back to his dinner. And then, a minute later, without looking up, he said the thing that undid her, the thing that proved Adelaide right about everything, about the perceptiveness, about how these kids carry what they shouldn't have to. "Does this mean you can stop being scared about money? Because I know you think I don't notice, but you do the thing with the bills where you sort them into piles and you think I'm asleep. I notice. I've been trying to figure out how to fix it, but money isn't like a machine. I can't take it apart and see what's wrong." He finally looked up, 9 years old, carrying 11 months of a thing no child should carry. "Is the money okay now? Actually okay? You can tell me the truth. I'd rather know the truth." Tess came around the table and pulled her son into her arms, and he let her, which at 9 was not a guarantee, and she said into his hair, "Yeah, it's actually okay now. You can stop trying to fix it. That was never your job. I'm sorry you ever thought it was your job." "It wasn't your job either," Daniel said, muffled against her shoulder, with the devastating logic that was the whole of who he was. "But you did it anyway. So I figured I should try too." And Tess held her impossible son in the small apartment over the saved bakery with the sign he'd named still hanging in the dark outside, and understood that Adelaide Frost had seen, in a photograph of a rebuilt mixer, the entire truth of them. That the gift wasn't the boy's cleverness. It was that the boy had learned from somewhere from her that you don't accept the broken thing. You get under it and you fix it, even when it's not your job, even when you're too small. Even when grown engineers would argue for an hour about whether it's possible, while the thing sits there working. The job was harder than Adelaide had promised, and Adelaide had promised it would be hard. Tess started 3 weeks later, after the judgment was vacated. It was, cleanly, the way Adelaide said it would be. Bram Hollies' lawyer didn't even fight it, because there was nothing to fight once the real maintenance records surfaced, and Hollies himself never appeared, never knew, went on with his condo deal in another building across town, exactly as Adelaide had predicted. A man who'd go to his grave thinking he'd won. She kept the bakery, hired a second baker, finally, with the breathing room of fair rent and a real salary. A young woman named Priya who'd been turned down for loans at 4 banks, and whom Tess recognized on sight as a version of herself 8 years ago. And hiring her felt like paying back a debt to a universe that had, for once, paid one to her. And then she walked into the headquarters of Frost Equipment, a building of glass and engineers, and discovered exactly how much the engineers did not want her there. It wasn't cruelty. Adelaide had been precise about that too. They'll hate you for about 6 months, she'd said, and it wasn't hate. It was something more bureaucratic and more wounding. The polite resistance of credentialed people to an uncredentialed person who'd been given authority over their work. Tess sat in her first design review, a new midline convection oven, 2 years in development, the engineers proud of it, and she listened to the presentation, and she understood maybe 60% of the technical language, and she felt every old fear rise up, the you don't belong here fear, the they're going to find out you're a fraud fear, the fear of a woman who made bread sitting in a room full of people with engineering degrees. And then they got to the maintenance access panel, and Tess saw it, the thing her whole life had trained her to see, and she raised her hand, and the room turned to her with the patient skepticism of experts humoring a layperson. That panel, Tess said, the one you need to remove to clean the convection fan. How often does it need cleaning? Every 2 weeks in heavy use, an engineer said. It's in the manual. And to remove it you need, Tess looked at the schematic. You need to pull the oven out from the wall, disconnect it, take off the back and remove 9 screws with 2 different screwdrivers. Every 2 weeks. That's correct. It's a thorough cleaning protocol. It's a protocol nobody will follow. Tess said it flatly, the way Adelaide said things, a fact. I want to be really clear about what happens in the actual world with this oven. The owner of the bakery, who is also the baker, and the bookkeeper, and the person mopping the floor at 11 at night, is not going to pull this oven out from the wall and remove 9 screws with 2 screwdrivers every 2 weeks. She's going to do it once, maybe twice, and then she's going to be exhausted and behind, and she's going to skip it, and the fan's going to clog, and the oven's going to run hot on one side, and her bread's going to come out wrong, and she's going to think she's a bad baker when actually she's got a clogged fan she was never realistically going to be able to clean. And then the oven's going to fail early, years early, and she's going to get a repair quote she can't afford, and she's going to blame herself, and she's going to tell every other baker she knows that Frost ovens don't last. Tess looked around the room. You designed a cleaning protocol for a maintenance technician who doesn't exist. The person who owns this oven is the technician, and she's also 5 other people, and she's tired. Design the panel so she can pop it off in 30 seconds with her hands and clean the fan while the bread's proving. That's the whole fix. You've built a beautiful oven for a customer who doesn't exist and ignored the one who does. The room was quiet. Then the lead engineer, a man named Gus Vrabel, 30 years at Frost, who Tess would later learn had been the most resistant to her hiring of anyone, looked at the schematic for a long moment, and then looked at Tess, and said slowly, "How do you know it'll clog in 2 weeks if she skips it? The 2-week protocol's conservative. It'd probably go a month. Because I ran a bakery for 8 years with a convection oven and a fan exactly like that one," Tess said, "and I skipped the cleaning because I was tired, because I was always tired and it clogged. And my bread ran wrong on one side for a year before a repair guy found it, and I spent that whole year thinking I'd lost my touch. I didn't lose my touch. I had a clogged fan I was never going to be able to reach. I lived your design flaw, Mr. Vrabel, for a year." wondering what was wrong with me. That's how I know. Gus Vrabel looked at her, and something shifted in his face. Not capitulation. Not yet. Adelaide had said 6 months, and she'd been right. It took most of 6 months, but the first crack in it, the dawning recognition that the woman who made bread knew something about his oven that 30 years of engineering had never taught him, which was what it was actually like to be the person who owned it. "Okay," he said gruffly, and made a note, the same gruff note Tess would come to recognize as the sound of an engineer being changed against his will. "Redesigned the access panel, tool-free, 30-second protocol." He looked at her one more time and added, almost to himself, "Nobody's ever sat in this room and described what it's like to own one of these things. 30 years, nobody." He shook his head. "Huh." And Tess Calloway, who 3 weeks earlier had sat on a wet courthouse step believing her useful life was over, sat in a glass conference room full of engineers who were starting, grudgingly, against their will, to listen to her, and felt the thing Adelaide had promised. Not that it would be easy, but that it would be hers, earned, real, the opposite of charity. The access panel was a victory, but one victory doesn't change a culture, and the months after were harder than that first meeting led her believe. There's always a man named Royston, mid-level, ambitious, who'd been at Frost 8 years and had decided, somewhere in the first weeks, that Tess Calloway was a threat. Not to the products, to him. Because Tess had arrived with Adelaide's personal backing, with a vague, impressive title and a direct line to the founder. And Royston had spent 8 years clawing for exactly that kind of access, and watched it handed to a woman who, as he put it once in a meeting, he didn't know she could hear from the hall, literally made muffins for a living until a few months ago. He was clever about it, which made it worse. He never attacked her directly. Direct attacks could be answered. Instead, he undermined, the slow, corrosive way, agreeing with her in meetings, and then quietly reworking her input out of the specs afterward, scheduling key reviews for times he knew she had to pick up Daniel, framing her field knowledge as anecdotal against his data, doing the thing that ambitious, mediocre people do to talented outsiders, which is to make them feel, gradually, that they don't belong, until they leave on their own and save everyone the trouble of having seen them clearly. And it worked for a while the way it works, because Tess's oldest fear, the "you don't belong here, they're going to find out you're a fraud" fear, the fear of a woman who made bread among people with degrees, was exactly the fear Royston was feeding, and a fear that old doesn't need much feeding. There was a night about 4 months in when Tess sat in her car in the Frost parking lot after everyone had gone and seriously, concretely planned how she'd quit. She had the resignation half written in her head. The bakery was saved. She didn't need this. She could go back to the counter and the bread and the world she understood, where she wasn't anecdotal, where she wasn't the muffin lady, where no Royston spent his days quietly proving she didn't belong. It would be such a relief. That was the seduction of it. That quitting would feel like relief, like taking off shoes that didn't fit, and she sat in the dark car and let herself want the relief. And then she thought about Daniel. Not in a sentimental way, in a specific way. She thought about how Daniel at school was surrounded by his own Roystons, the system that called his gift a problem, the boredom that wanted him to bury himself, the institutional voice that said it's not on the test, and she thought about what she'd told him, what Adelaide had built the whole foundation around, which was, don't bury yourself to fit. Don't let them make you small. The discomfort of being early is not the same as being wrong. And she sat in the parking lot and understood that if she quit because a man named Royston had successfully made her feel like she didn't belong, she'd be doing the exact thing she was teaching her son not to do. She'd be burying herself to fit. She'd be letting the Roystons win the way the system won in the courtroom, not by being right, but by being relentless against someone who was right and tired. She didn't quit, but she didn't go to Adelaide either, which she could have, which would have ended Royston in an afternoon, because Tess had learned from Adelaide herself that the help that comes from above doesn't change the thing that needs changing. The engineers had to come to respect her on their own, or the respect meant nothing, and Royston had to lose in front of them, not get removed by the founder's hand, or she'd just be the muffin lady who ran to mommy. So she did the slow, hard thing, the bakery counter thing, the thing she was actually good at. She got better at the job than Royston could undermine. She stopped trying to win the meetings rhetorically and started simply being right so often, so specifically, so unassailably, that her field knowledge stopped being anecdotal and started being the thing the products lived or died on. She built alliances the real way, one fixed problem at a time. Gus Vrabel first, the most resistant, now her staunchest defender, the old engineer who'd come around hardest because he'd resisted hardest. And Royston's undermining, which had worked when she was new and uncertain, slowly stopped working, because you can't convince a room that someone's a fraud when that someone keeps being the most useful person in it. And eventually Royston overplayed it, reworked one of her field specs out of a design to prove a point. The oven failed exactly the way she'd predicted it would in exactly the field conditions she'd described, and the failure had his fingerprints on it and her warning in the record. And that was that. He didn't get fired in a blaze. He just stopped being someone anyone listened to, which for a man like Royston was worse, and he left within the year for somewhere he could be the biggest one in the room again. And Tess felt about him roughly what she'd come to feel about Bram Hollies, which was a kind of distant nothing, the irrelevance that Adelaide said was the only real victory. She told Adelaide about it, after the whole thing, including the night in the parking lot. "You didn't come to me," Adelaide said. "It wasn't a question and there was approval in it. You could have. I'd have ended him by lunch. Why didn't you?" "Because you taught me that the help from above doesn't fix the thing. They had to come to respect me on their own, or it wasn't worth anything. And because," Tess hesitated, "because I was teaching Daniel not to bury himself to fit, and I couldn't do that and then quit the first time a man made me feel small. I'd have been a liar. Kids can smell a liar." Adelaide was quiet for a moment, the pale eyes steady. "That's the whole secret of raising one of these children," she said finally. "And almost no one understands it. You think you're teaching them with what you say. You're not. You're teaching them with what you do when you think the lesson's over. Daniel will not remember a single thing you ever told him about courage. He'll remember that his mother sat in a dark parking lot wanting to quit and went back in the next morning. He'll remember it without knowing he remembers it, and it'll be in his hands when he's 40 and someone's trying to make him feel small, the way the colored tabs are in his hands already." She nodded slowly. "I made the muffin lady mistake too, decades ago. Let an ambitious mediocrity drive a brilliant young woman out of my own company because I was too busy to see it happening. I've regretted it for 30 years, so I'm glad you stayed, not for the company. For the lesson Daniel doesn't know he's learning. That's the only curriculum that ever takes." Daniel's mentor was a woman named Inez Reyes, and Adelaide had chosen her with the same care she chose everything. Inez was 40, an aerospace engineer who'd left the industry to teach because, she told Tess at their first meeting, she'd burned out on building things that killed people and wanted to build people who'd make things that didn't. She was blunt and warm in unequal measure, mostly blunt, and she'd worked with a dozen of Adelaide's kids, and she met Daniel for the first time in the bakery on a Saturday morning, and Tess watched the whole thing from behind the counter with her heart in her throat. Inez didn't talk down to him. That was the first thing, the thing Tess had been most afraid of, the adult crouching to the child's level with the bright false voice. Inez pulled up a chair across from Daniel at the little bakery table, set down a paper bag and said, "Your mom says you have questions about humidity control in proofing systems that nobody will answer. I have answers, but first I want to see how you think, so I brought you a broken thing." She took out of the bag a small mechanism, some kind of clockwork, gears, and a spring, clearly broken, clearly deliberate. "This is a music box movement. It doesn't play." "I don't know why it doesn't play, that's true. I genuinely don't. I broke it on purpose and then mixed up which thing I broke, so we're both figuring it out fresh. I'll make you a deal. We figure out why it's broken together as equals. And along the way, I'll answer every humidity question you have. And you'll answer some questions for me, because I've never met anyone who rebuilt a Hartwell mixer at 9, and I have my own curiosity to satisfy. Deal. Daniel looked at the broken music box. Then he looked at Inez, and Tess saw on her son's face an expression she had never seen there before, not once in 9 years, the expression of a child encountering, for the first time, an adult who was going to take him completely seriously. Deal, Daniel said, and reached for the music box and was gone, lost into it, the way he got lost into machines, and Inez leaned back and let him. And after a minute Daniel said, not looking up, "It's not the spring." Everyone would think it's the spring. "It's not the spring." And Inez said, "Why not the spring?" And Daniel started to explain, and Tess Calloway stood behind the counter of the bakery her son had named, watching her impossible boy talk as an equal to an aerospace engineer about a broken music box, and had to go into the back so the customers wouldn't see her cry. It became a Saturday thing, then a Saturday and Wednesday thing. Inez brought broken things and Daniel fixed them and asked his questions and got real answers. And slowly, over months, a workshop took shape in the back room of the bakery. Adelaide had insisted, the workshop comes to him. He doesn't go to some sterile lab. He works above the bread where his mother is. That's the whole model. And Daniel had tools, real ones, and problems worth his brain, and a mentor who never once told him a thing wasn't on the test. And his report cards got worse before they got better, which Adelaide had also predicted. He'll start failing the boring things harder once he has permission to find them boring, she'd warned. Hold steady. The school will tell you the foundation's ruining him, the foundation's freeing him. There's a difference, and it looks identical from the outside for about a year. And it was true, there was a hard stretch, a parent-teacher meeting where Mr. Okonkwo, well-meaning and overwhelmed, suggested Daniel was becoming disengaged. And Tess had to hold the line, had to trust Adelaide and Inez over the institutional voice that had always, her whole life, been the voice you deferred to. She held the line. And on the other side of the hard stretch was a different Daniel, not a boy who'd learned to love the times tables. That was never going to happen, but a boy who'd stopped burying himself, who'd stopped pretending to be average to fit, who came home lit up instead of dimmed. Adelaide came to visit every few months. No helicopter. She'd been right that the helicopter was a mistake. And she came by car now, ordinary, and sat in the bakery and ate the bread, and argued with Daniel about engineering and with Tess about the company, and became, without anyone quite deciding it, a kind of grandmother to a boy who'd never had one, and a kind of something Tess didn't have a word for to a woman who'd been alone in her fight for a very long time. "Why do you really do it?" Tess asked her once late, after closing, the two of them alone with the last of the coffee. "The foundation, the kids. You've told me the reasons, but I don't think you've told me the reason." Adelaide was quiet for a while. "I had a son," she said finally. "A long time ago. He was like Daniel." Exactly like Daniel, the machines, the inside-out way of seeing, the questions nobody would answer. She turned her coffee cup slowly on the table. "And I was building the company, in the years when a woman building a company had to work twice as hard and trust no one, and I was tired, and I was scared about money the way you were scared about money, and I didn't see what he needed in time. I thought there'd be time. I thought I'd get the company stable, and then I'd have room to be the mother he needed." And she stopped, started again, with the precision of a woman who'd told this to almost no one and needed to get it exactly right or not at all. He didn't make it to adulthood. It doesn't matter how. What matters is that he was a Daniel, and he had a mother who was too busy surviving to see him, and the world apologized for him. And by the time I looked up from the company I'd built to keep us safe, the thing I'd built it for was gone. She looked at Tess, the pale eyes wet for the only time Tess ever saw. So when a photograph of a rebuilt mixer crossed my desk, and I found out it was a 9-year-old, and I found out his mother was sitting in a courtroom that very morning fighting to keep the small business that kept him safe, Tess, I didn't get in that helicopter for Daniel. Or not only. I got in it for my son. For the version of the story where the tired mother gets help in time. I can't go back and be the mother I should have been, but I can be the helicopter. I can be the thing that arrives in time for somebody else's boy. That's the whole of it. That's the reason under the reasons. Every child we catch is the one I didn't. I'll never catch him. But I keep catching the others, and it's the closest thing to forgiveness this life offers people like me who figured out what mattered a few years too late. She wiped her eyes once, briskly done. Now you know. I don't tell people, but you asked the real question, so you got the real answer. That's the deal you and I have always had since the steps. The real answer or none. It would be a lie to say everything after was easy. And Tess had learned, from Adelaide and from the worst day of her life, that the lies were never worth telling. There were hard parts. Tess's old fear didn't vanish just because her circumstances changed. Fear has its own life, outlives its reasons, and there were nights in the first year when she lay awake out of pure habit, doing math that no longer needed doing, her body still braced for a fall that wasn't coming, and she had to learn slowly, the way you learn anything real, that she was allowed to stop bracing. That took longer than the job did. The money problem Adelaide solved in an afternoon. The fear the money problem had built took years to fully drain, and some of it never entirely did, and Tess made a kind of peace with that, because a little of that fear had become part of how she saw the world, the thing that made her good at her job, the thing that let her see the clogged fan and the $4,000 repair and the tired baker who'd blame herself. She didn't want all of it gone. She just wanted it to stop running her at 3 in the morning, and eventually, mostly, it did. There were hard parts with Daniel, too. A gifted child is still a child. The gift doesn't exempt anyone from being 9, then 10, then a teenager, with all the ordinary difficulty that comes with it. And there were stretches where Daniel was just a moody kid who didn't want to do his chores. And Tess had to remember that Adelaide had warned her about this too. Don't let the gift become the whole of how you see him. He needs to be a boy who takes out the trash as much as he needs to be a prodigy, maybe more. Because the prodigy will take care of itself, and the boy is the part that becomes a good man. So Tess made him take out the trash. She made him be ordinary on purpose, in the ordinary ways, because Adelaide had taught her that the workshop and the mentor and the foundation were the easy gifts, and that the hard gift, the one that mattered, was raising a kid who'd be kind, who'd remember where he came from, who wouldn't grow up to be a man in an expensive suit turning the truth sideways against someone with a folder of colored tabs. She thought about Bram Hollis sometimes, not often and never for long, because Adelaide had been right that the best revenge on a small man is a large life he's not in. But sometimes, signing off on a redesigned oven that a real baker could actually afford to maintain, or watching Daniel explain a repair to Inez, or just standing behind the counter of the saved bakery under the sign her son named, she'd think of the man who'd let the heat fail in January and taken her to court and gone home thinking he'd won. And she'd feel something that wasn't quite gratitude to him, but was adjacent to it. The strange recognition that the worst thing anyone had ever done to her had been the hinge the whole rest of her life turned on. If Bram Hollis had been a decent landlord, she'd never have withheld the rent, never have gone to court, never have lost, never have sat on the wet step on the morning Adelaide happened to be watching. The mixer photo had already been in the world, but Adelaide had timed the helicopter to the worst day on purpose, to see what Tess was made of, and the worst day had been Bram Hollis's doing. He'd built the disaster that became the door. He'd never know it. He'd go to his grave thinking he won, and in a way Tess hoped he kept thinking it, because a man like that being haunted by what he'd accidentally given her would be a kind of suffering, and she found, to her own surprise, that she didn't want him to suffer. She just wanted to never think about him again, which was, Adelaide said, the only real victory there ever was over people like that. Not their downfall, but their irrelevance. Daniel was 16 when the oven came out. It had Tess's fingerprints all over it, though her name wasn't on the patents. The patents belonged to the engineers, to Gus Vrabel and his team, who'd long since stopped resenting her and started, in the gruff way of engineers, actively seeking her out, walking down to her office with schematics, asking what would the tired baker think of this. The oven was the first one Frost had ever built from the customer in, instead of the laboratory out. Tool-free maintenance. A fan you could clean in 30 seconds while the bread proved, built to last 20 years instead of being cheaper today, priced for the small operator who was also 5 other people and always tired. They called it, in the catalog, the Calloway line, because Gus Vrabel had insisted, over Tess's embarrassed objection, that it be named for the woman who'd told them for 6 years what it was actually like to own one of the damn things. It became, quietly, the most successful product in the company's history, because it turned out that the customer who didn't exist in the laboratory existed everywhere in the real world, by the hundreds of thousands, tired and skipping the cleaning and blaming herself, and somebody had finally built a machine that saw her. Adelaide was 80 by then, slower, but still sharp, still arriving by ordinary car to argue with Daniel, who towered over her now and argued back as an equal in earnest, 2 engineers separated by 60 years and not much else. She came to the launch. She stood in the back, the way she'd stood in the back of the courtroom 7 years before, watching, and afterward she found Tess and said, dry as ever, "You built a machine that sees the tired woman. Do you understand what you did? You took the worst day of your life, the day you were the invisible tired woman that nobody saw, that the judge didn't see, that your landlord counted on no one seeing, and you turned it into a machine that makes sure the next tired woman gets seen. That's not a job, Tess. That's an act of revenge against the entire shape of the world that broke you, the most useful kind, the kind that helps people instead of hurting the one who deserves it." The not quite smile, older now, but the same. "I knew it on the steps. I want you to know that. I didn't hope it. I knew it. The colored tabs told me everything. A woman who organizes the truth that carefully on the day it's failing her worst is a woman who's going to spend her life making sure the truth gets seen. I just gave you a bigger room to do it in. You'd have done it in the bakery. You'd have done it anywhere. I only changed the scale." Adelaide Frost died when Daniel was 19, in the ordinary way, old and in her sleep. The company long since arranged to outlast her, and the foundation endowed to run for a century. She left the foundation to Tess. Not the company went where companies go, to the structures built to hold them. But the foundation, the only part she'd ever cared about, the part that found the early children before the world apologized for them, she left to Tess Calloway with a letter, 1 page, in a precise old hand. "Tess, you'll run it better than I did because you've been on the steps and I was only ever the helicopter. I knew the children needed catching. You know what it feels like to be the one drowning, which means you'll catch them differently, sooner, gentler. Find the tired mothers. That's the secret I learned too late and you knew already. You don't only save the child, you save the one who kept the child alive, because a saved child with a drowning mother is only half saved, and I spent too many years catching half. Catch the whole family. Catch the colored tabs. The cleverness takes care of itself. The world's full of clever. What's rare is the stubborn refusal to let the broken thing stay broken, and that doesn't come from the child, it comes through the child, from someone tireder and braver standing behind the counter. Find those someones. They're sitting on courthouse steps all over this country, crying, certain it's over, organizing the truth with colored tabs that no one will look at. Go look at the tabs. That's the whole job. I'm glad I got in the helicopter. It was the least vulgar thing I ever did. AF. Daniel became an engineer. Of course he became an engineer, though not the kind anyone expected. He didn't go to the prestigious places, didn't chase the prestigious problems. He went into the unglamorous machines, the ones that bakeries and small restaurants and ordinary people run on, the proofing systems and the convection fans and the things that break and get a $4,000 repair quote that closes a small business 2 months early. He spent his career, the way his mother spent hers, building machines that saw the tired person who owned them. He kept the bakery, too, the rolling pin, still open, still with the sign he'd named, run now by Priya, who'd long since become a partner, who'd hired her own tired person turned away by 4 banks, the debt to the universe paying itself forward the way it does when someone finally interrupts the other direction. And Tess ran the foundation and did exactly what Adelaide's letter said. She didn't look for clever children. She looked for the tired someone standing behind them. She developed over the years a sense for it, a way of finding not the prodigy but the prodigy's exhausted, stubborn, unseen guardian, the one organizing the truth with colored tabs that nobody would look at. She'd go look at the tabs. She'd arrive, not in a helicopter, she agreed with Adelaide about the helicopter, but in an ordinary car on the worst day, when the person was certain it was over, and she'd sit down on the wet step beside them, and she'd say the thing Adelaide had said to her, the thing that was the truest thing she knew. You did everything right. That's rather the point. You did everything right and you lost anyway because the system was too tired to tell the difference. But I came to tell you that somebody saw. Because that, in the end, was what Adelaide Frost had actually brought in the helicopter. The opportunity of a lifetime that wasn't really the job or the building or the saved bakery or any of it. The opportunity was being seen. On the worst day, at the lowest point, organizing the truth with colored tabs against a man who could afford to bury it. Tess Calloway had been completely, utterly invisible, the way the system needs the tired and the poor and the right butt-out gun to be invisible, because invisible is how it gets away with it. And a woman had come out of the gray sky and crossed the street and said, I saw the whole thing, and that not the money, not the machines, not the vacated judgment, that was the thing that turned the worst day into the first day. You did everything right, somebody saw. Tess spent the rest of her life making sure she was the somebody, for as many tired, stubborn, unseen people as she could reach, because she understood now what Adelaide had understood too late and then spent 30 years making up for. That the world is full of people sitting on steps, certain it's over, organized and right and beaten anyway, and that almost all of them never get the helicopter, never get the stranger crossing the street, never get told that their colored tabs were the most beautiful thing in the building. She made sure as many of them as she could got told. The sign still hangs over the bakery, the rolling pin. A 9-year-old named it because he thought it was funny, and his mother let him because his laugh was the first real one in a hard year, and you don't say no to a laugh like that. And that small yes, that refusal to let the broken thing stay broken, that stubborn, ordinary love behind a bakery counter, turned out to be the thing that a woman in a helicopter could see from 300 miles away, because it was the rarest thing there is, and she'd spent her whole life learning to recognize it. And she found it, finally, in a photograph of a rebuilt mixer, on the worst morning of a tired woman's life, just in time. Just in time, that was the whole of it, not too late the way it had been for Adelaide's son. Just in time, the way it can be, sometimes, for somebody, if someone's watching, if someone gets in the helicopter, if someone crosses the street and sits down on the wet step and says the words that change a worst day into a first one. I saw you did everything right. Now let me show you what happens next.